All right. Hi, everyone. Looks like only a few folks here, and they are my students from my classroom. Hello, Fletcher and Nico. All right. I'm glad you love fork knife, Nico. Okay, so let's jump into a couple of things I wanted to get into, and then I'll do a question and answer afterwards. So, first thing I want to talk about is I have resources that I want to go through that are located right below in the information and the comments and everything. And I can post it in the comment here as well. But I just want to go through some tips and tricks for the written portions of the AP exam. First thing I want to do is the SAQ, which for some reason my students this year have really struggled on. So I'm going to place a document right now in the chat. Sadly, Google or YouTube, YouTube from Google does not have screen share unless I add in some other application or whatever, and it's just a big hassle. So I just put the documents with the formulas for SAQs and everything like that right in the chat, and also in the information below. So the first thing I want to go to is SAQs. Well, it looks like John Adams thinks SAQs are easy. For some reason, my kids have struggled with them this year, but I put it right in the chat there. So let's go check out that SAQ Ace Formula. I'm going to turn down my light as well. All right, there we go. Okay, so right now I'm looking at the SAQ Ace Formula, and this is the most common formula taught to AP US history students. So if you haven't seen it yet, well, here it is. And even for those that have seen it and have been taught it, this is a good reminder to use it during the AP exam. Because for SAQs, if you can go through these steps, highly more likely you'll get the points for the SAQ. Because every SAQ has basically for each sub question, 1A, 1B, 1C, it's a 0 or a 1. You either get a 1 for 1A or a 1 for 1B and a 1 for 1C, or you don't get them. So you want to try to rack up as many points as possible out of the 9 total points you have in the SAQ between the 3 different sets of questions. And of course, everyone has to do the first 2 questions, the SAQ set number 1 and set number 2, and then you'll have a choice between sets 3 and 4. But this formula right here, if you're looking on with me right now, the ACE formula is your best bet to secure points on the SAQ. So the first thing you want to do in an SAQ is you want to answer the question directly. Use the correct historical thinking skill. Sometimes they're asking for, what's the main idea of an excerpt? And sometimes there is no stimulus. Sometimes there is no graph or excerpt from a historian or primary source or anything. And you just have to address, are they asking you for an effect? Are they asking you for some specific type of explanation of an event or a process or whatever? So you want to do that. You want to do like a little mini claim. Now you're not writing an essay, but you still want to have a bit of a claim of the question, you're responding directly to the question. And the next thing is, I think, the one where a lot of students falter in the SAQ, which is that citing of evidence. So I'm highlighting that right now. If you're on the document with me, I'm highlighting that one right now. So you need to cite some specific historical evidence. A lot of times students will just kind of rephrase if there is a stimulus there, like a excerpt from a historian, they'll just rephrase something from the historian, but you got to be specific with it. You got to have some sort of piece of legislation, some really specific process, because that's what graders are looking for. They're looking for that evidence that shows you actually know what you're talking about. You're not just rephrasing what you see in the source or rephrasing parts of the question with, vague kind of allusions to evidence. It's got to be something specific. And last thing is, make sure you fully explain it. I've seen this sometimes where students will be very short in their actual evidence, but then they won't use SAQs. And sometimes they do just enough. Like they'll have the evidence and they'll explain it just enough, but other times it falls short. So I'll give you an example. for instance, let's say you're responding to something about, let's say there's some kind of question about like the impact of the Constitution. And you cite the evidence of something along the lines that it creates, checks and balances or something like that, within the government. Okay, go in depth. What does that mean to have checks and balances? Don't just say checks and balances are a result of the Constitution. What does it mean? There is some sort, explain how there is some sort of power sharing then. There's some sort of way that prevents possible tyranny from one branch of the government to another one. So that kind of goes in that explanation. So you might have had the citing evidence of checks and balances, but then explain what are checks and balances of the Constitution. So you got to get to that. So using this will, be your best route to securing those points for the SAQ. Can you not use this and be much more direct and short in your response and still get the points? Yeah, it's possible, especially if you have great outside evidence. But this formula will be your best bet to making sure that you get the points. Okay, the next thing I want to take a look at is I'm going to flip to, and I'll put it in the chat here. I'm going to flip to DBQs and LEQs. So I'm going to copy that and I'll put it in the chat right here. It's also in the video information below. All right. So I'm going to this document right now in the chat, context and thesis. And the reason why I want to talk about this one is because this is common between both the DBQs and LEQs. In a DBQ, the context and thesis points are 2 out of the 7 points. And in years past, when you look at the average, the amount of points that the average student earns on the actual AP exam for the DBQ, it's usually somewhere around 2.7 out of 7 or 2.9. I've never seen it 3 or greater than that. So 2 of those points should be coming in your first paragraph. And there's another third point that if you want to get to like that 50% level right there, about half the students, and that's just using or explaining 3 of the documents. So you really want to take that first paragraph in the DBQ very seriously. And your first paragraph should be very large. Now, technically, you can do the context anywhere in the essay, but as an AP reader for 5 years, most of the time it's attempted in the intro, and that's the most that's the place that it's most common to see it and the most natural place for it to be, which is to set up your thesis with some context. Now, I put on, if you're on that document with me, I put on the bottom right down here a key note. So before we go through this example, check out my note here. So this example of contextualization goes above and beyond the one I'm going to go through in a second, but take note of the specific details. A lot of AP students attempt contextualization, and I think a lot of AP students think they're going to get it. But out of my experience of being an AP reader, this is the point that like a lot of students attempt, but they fail to actually achieve it. They come up short. And it's usually because of a lack of specific details. So it's, just like a bad thesis statement, same thing for context. Years past about how many people achieve the contextualization point. It's generally only about 30% of the students who wrote the DBQ, the hundreds of thousands that take the AP exam, actually achieve the context point. So this is an example, the one that I have that I shared on that document. I see there's about 15 folks on there right now. And in the red is contextualization. Now this example, this is just from a student of mine in a previous year. I just took one of their essays. So this is not one that's this is not one that I created myself. This is one from my own students. And so, it's a timed essay that they wrote in class, not like a take home or anything. So there could definitely be more polished examples of contextualization, but I wanted to show you just one of just coming in and writing one and a really solid example. So this one probably goes a bit above and beyond what you would need, but it's a great example of that. So if our prompt was this, so period 4 into periods 5 and 6 prompt, evaluate the extent to which Western expansion had a positive impact on American society in the 1830 to 1890 time period. And I believe this was actually a previous prompt on an exam a few years ago. So let's check out their contextualization attempt here and see what they do. Now, this first sentence doesn't really do a whole lot for contextualization. The person puts, in this time period of 1830 to 1890, American society and economy were going through great changes. It really doesn't do much for you there. Like, that's a really vague statement. It's fine to kind of like just get your footing as a writer to start off with that. But, and a lot of people will start off with that, but you're not making any kind of like headway towards your actual goal of contextualization, because you could say this about any time period. Because the meat of the context really comes into play here, and where the student really picks up the point. So the person starts talking about the market revolution. Fantastic. That is a part of this era that it's in. It's actually a little bit before the era. Market revolution, generally period 4. So starting around 1800 or so. That's all those new inventions and everything. And it goes right into this time period of 1830 to 1890 as well. It goes right to like 1830 and 1840. Because the era of the market revolution is generally 1800, 1848 or wherever. There's not like a specific like end date for it. It just kind of evolves into the Industrial Revolution. But okay, so we got a study of the market revolution, really nice. In the early part of the time period, introduced inventions such as interchangeable parts, all right, spinning jenny, and power loom. And the person keeps going, and railroads and steamboats. All right, this is good. Now, would the person get context with just this? Not enough yet. Plus, it also doesn't completely, there's some connections to westward expansion, but the person is not making it like explicit at all as well. So the context needs to kind of come back around at some point to the topic of the prompt. Let's keep going though. These inventions would lead to a booming cotton economy in the South and a burgeoning industrial economy in the North. Westward expansion. All right, now we're getting to the meat of the topic here. So we have this kind of overall market revolution, and now we're narrowing in even further to the actual topic of the prompt. Westward expansion was happening in 2 phases throughout the time period. The first wave of settlement was of horse-drawn caravans on paths such as the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail. That's really nice. This student would probably get the contextualization point just from this. New inventions of the railroad and steamboat, which made travel to the new Western territories even easier, such as the first Continental Railroad completed in 1869, which led to greater access to the Western territories. Also, the Second Great Awakening. So all of this is fine. And this student didn't really even need this second part, which actually kind of goes off in a little bit of a different direction. But let's go through it anyways. So also, the Second Great Awakening was changing American society by greatly changing Protestantism in the U.S. The Second Great Awakening focused on bettering American society to create the perfect American system. Attempts at bettering society eventually led to the abolition, temperance, and women's suffrage movements. So again, this one goes above and beyond, and this was a really, really solid student of mine. And and this last part, you'd probably actually put more towards the beginning, because the middle part of this, a context attempt, should probably be towards what leads into the thesis, as it gets towards the actual topic of Western settlement. But I think this person's mindset was just like, I'm going to write everything I know about 1830 to 1890. That's even somewhat related to the topic of the prompt. So they added that in there. But this one goes above and beyond. All right. So let's take a look next at the second point that should be in your intro paragraph for both LEQs and DBQs. And when I mentioned DBQs before, the intro, you can get 2 out of the points right in the intro, context and thesis. For LEQs, you can get 1/3 of the overall points for the LEQ. There's 6 points total. And just like the DBQ, you want to have context and thesis, as a part of it. It's 2 out of those 6 points. So 1/3 of those points you can get right there in the intro. And also keep in mind too, for a lot of folks who are taking the AP exam, you're going to spend more of your time on the DBQ, or to 15% for the LEQ. And so you want to spend more time on the DBQ. So you might be scrambling with the LEQ, and you'll have some options. You'll have 3 different options to pick from. So, you might only have time for an intro paragraph and then a body paragraph to try to pick up some evidence points. But let's check out this thesis attempt here. Not the greatest thesis example, but it definitely gets the point. So in blue, we got In this setting, Western expansion greatly achieved a positive impact on American society by allowing for American civilization to expand and grow, providing opportunities for many Americans who ventured west, and for the U.S. to extract incredible amounts of valuable natural resources that increased the wealth of the United States. So notice, the big notice, there was not, like, I guarantee if this was the actual prompt that I was reading for an AP exam, there would be a whole lot of like thesis statements that would be, there were a lot of social, political, and economic positive impacts of Western expansion that never gets a point. If you say something like that, they'll never get the point on an AP exam. You got to have a specific argument. All right. And for this one, we have a specific argument. If we look at some of these specifics, we got expand and grow. We got providing opportunities for those who ventured west. We got extracting incredible amounts of valuable resources and increasing the wealth. So if I'm an AP reader, this is a clear argument. They're saying wealth is going to increase because of that expansion west. They're saying that there's incredible valuable resources out west. And they're also saying it's opportunities for Americans who ventured west. That's a great specific argument, and we'll set up their body paragraphs, or possibly just one paragraph, but it sets up a great kind of body paragraph or paragraphs later on. Okay, so that was context and thesis that I want to go through. Let's see. Let's go to my HAPP resource, the HIP or HAPP point on the DBQ. I'm going to put that in the chat. Yeah, I'm going to do questions right when I get done going through these couple of resources. All right. So I'm going to put that one in there. I'm going to switch to this one right now, which is going to be about HIP or the HAPP point. There's a couple different ways. I think I've even heard a few other different acronyms for this point as well on the DBQ. All right, so I see some folks, we're all heading to the HAPP or HIP sourcing template. Okay, so the HIP point on the DBQ is another one kind of like context, where a lot of kids attempt it, but not a whole lot achieve it. And there's one really big reason why. They don't achieve the point because they don't connect the HIP back to their argument, which is the really hard part of this point. It's not enough to just say, like, let's say you have a source from, it even says it in the source, a conservative economist, or it's from a president or something like that. And somebody says, and the point of view of this source is from the American president or something like that. That's not going to get you. And that's like the really difficult thing. Now, this point is a bit divisive. I know some AP US history teachers really like certain specific skills to go for, but I'm just going to go for what I've seen as being an AP reader for 5 years. And what I've seen from being an AP reader for 5 years is that the kids who try for audience, it usually doesn't work out for them. And the reason being is audience, and I even have it in my if you look at on the document, I even have it as like a little side note here. Be careful with intended audience. A lot of people love to do this. They love to say, and the intended audience of document B or the title of the document, whatever, they'll say, is the American people. That gets you nowhere. That doesn't get you anything. It doesn't relate it. It's very vague. It doesn't relate it back to your argument. There's no way to relate that back to an argument. So if you're thinking like, oh, I'm going to use audience for this one out of my 3 going for the HIP point, it's probably not going to work out. There's very few times out of the thousands of essays that I've graded at the AP readings where audience has actually worked out. So if you ask me which 2 do I think gets the points the most and are successful in getting to your 3 documents to get to that point on the DBQ, in my personal experience of grading these things and everything like that, it's historical situation, also sometimes called historical context, and purpose. those two. And the reason being is this: for historical situation, if you have a document, a lot of times, and if you know the document well, like in my example here, let's say the 73 Tea Act that in part led to the Boston Tea Party. If you bring up that Tea Act in your discussion of the document about the Boston Tea Party, the document could be a source from Ben Franklin talking about it. It could be, an engraving of the Boston Tea Party, whatever it may be. But it doesn't say anything about the Tea Act. If you bring up the Tea Act as context, well, that all you got to do is bring that up and talk about how that leads to the Boston Tea Party. And it also, the other thing that would also probably do, if this was a DBQ prompt about, reasons for the revolution, it probably would go to help prove a thesis point about British restrictions. So you would, one, it'd be some little bit of outside information that's linked to one of the documents. And two, it would help to prove your thesis if it was about like causes of the revolution, let's say. All right. Now, the other one that I really like, I know some teachers, I've heard some teachers say they don't like this that much, but as an AP reader, this one tends to do well in accurately picking up the points, and that's purpose. And the reason why for purpose is you're usually with a document going to be talking about a document's person if you know purpose, if you know it well. So let's say you have a document that's, let's say it's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That's the resolution that led to the ability for Lyndon Johnson to expand the war in Vietnam. All right, very, very important document. Who knows what the DBQ is about, something with Vietnam society and everything like that. So if you have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you could easily bring up the purpose of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is to give war powers to the two, big debates and discussions about the power of the presidency, about the role of the US in Vietnam, and like, should we have expanded our influence in Vietnam? So it's pretty easy to tie in the purpose to your argument. So that's why that one's my second favorite one for students to use, because I think it's not that difficult to tie that into your argument as well. Now, another one that is not a bad one to use, but sometimes students do not go far enough with it, and that is point of view. So the reason why some students don't go far enough with point of view with their HIP is they'll just have kind of a vague reference to the author of a document. Let's say the author is George Washington, and they'll just say something along the lines of, the point of view is of George Washington, the first president of the United States. That's not going to get you one out of the three, your way towards the three documents that you need to hit for that point. You have to bring it back around to like the context of your argument, like what you're trying to work towards. So my hypothetical DBQ, let's say we had a DBQ about the Gilded Age, one of my favorite eras, although I know a lot of people don't care for the Gilded Age. And let's say you have a document that's from a farmer and it's about the populist movement, which is a movement, make sure you know, for some reason, the populists show up a lot on AP exams. So the document is from a farmer, from a populist farmer, Midwest, Kansas, Oklahoma, somewhere around there. And, they're talking about like, what would be the benefit of the United States leaving the gold standard, which would be good for farmers. So a way you could use that is, from this person's point of view, then it would make his commodities, his corn, his wheat, he would get more money for it if money was losing its value. If you left the gold standard, you went to bimetallism, or even if you went completely off any kind of standard, gold, silver, bimetallism, whatever, and then all of a sudden this farmer has like this big incentive to to get off that gold standard, and because it would help him out, it would make him more money. It'd be easier for him to pay off his mortgage to his farm that he might have to a bank. And so you have that point of view, like, it kind of gets into like biases and everything like that. He's going to stand to gain from the United States leaving the gold standard. So you have to take it that far. You have to go that extra step to link it back to your overall argument. You couldn't just say the point of view is of a farmer, a populist farmer in the Gilded Age. Okay, so why is that important? how does that go back to like, what is the main topic of your argument? Okay, so with that, got one more thing I want to cover, and then I'll do some Q&A. The last thing I want to cover was actually a request by a subscriber. And there's a lot more that I need to do with this. So I'm going to put this in the chat here. So I'm going to this document that I just dropped in the chat. And then I'll do Q&A right after this last. This is the last one I want to go through. All right, so I'm on historical connections. I'll wait a minute for folks to get there. So I thought this was actually, a great idea actually for future videos, which is to, because there are and other topics that come on the written portions of the exam that ask about connections between time periods and within time periods. And I literally just put this together in like, I don't know, a half an hour a little bit ago, but there are so many other ones. However, these are the ones that came to my mind as like ones that I've seen a lot, on AP exams, and just common ones that are connected within questions and everything. So one of them that you definitely should know, and this should definitely be a review to many of you, is George Washington's farewell address. In many years, in some way, shape, or form, George Washington's farewell address is touched upon on the AP exam. It has two separate but very important topics that are common themes throughout US history. The first one is about political parties. Oh, let me give you a little context for the farewell address. So George Washington gives this speech as he's about to leave office after the end of his second term. He's actually close to the end of his life as well. He dies 2 years after the end of his presidential term. And he's lived through, he was a soldier in the French and Indian War. And then, of course, he was the commander-in-chief during the Revolution. And then president, the first president for 2 terms. So he's given this farewell address, and he's given it as advice to our young nation. And there's 2 core pieces of advice that are linked many, many times to multiple choice questions and other things. The first one is about political parties. And it's about factions. Like basically, he says the word factions. You can take that to mean political parties. And he talks about how they cause division. At the time that George Washington is leaving office, it is the early days of the first party system of the excuse me. And so he sees them forming. He's like, don't do that. Don't form political parties because that is going to cause division. So when does this come up on an AP exam? Other times that, which is most of US history, that there are divisions because of political parties. A great example that's not too far after George Washington is between the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs. So an example question might be something about like, how does the division between Whigs and Jackson relate to, some previous, speech or warnings or something like that? Of course, George Washington's farewell address. So political parties. The other one, the second one, is his warning is stay out of European alliances or European conflicts. And most notably, this comes up with World War I, with the whole, alliance system leading to that war and everything. And but this would also be brought up anytime the U.S. becomes active in foreign policy. George Washington's farewell address kind of stands as like a historical counterpoint to that, as don't get involved in foreign conflicts. Okay, so a few other ones. Second Great Awakening shows up a lot. And a lot of times the Second Great Awakening is a religious movement that sparks new types of Protestantism and is popular in the backcountry and has different influences in the South and North and everything. But you got to link the Second Great Awakening to reform movements in the early to mid 1800s. A variety of reform movements, from prison reform, educational reform. The idea being that before the second coming of Jesus. So need to improve things a bit. So you see that like those linked together, Second Great Awakening with many of those early to mid 1800 reform movements. A few other things. Seneca Falls, also kind of a part, sometimes linked to the Second Great Awakening. But also Seneca Falls links to so many other things. And Seneca Falls / Declaration of Sentiments. Declaration of Sentiments is the women's rights document that's modeled upon the Declaration of Independence, past connection. And basically that can be linked to, well, the people of Seneca Falls who are fighting for equality for women would also agree with either wave of feminism, either the 19th Amendment movement in the 1900s and 1910s, or the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Another one that I should not even have to say, and that you should already know is closely linked, Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board. This should definitely be like something you already know and has been hammered into your head. Plessy versus Ferguson, basically marking the complete and other end to Reconstruction and any ability for African Americans to achieve true equality through Reconstruction. Basically, is in 1890s. Supreme Court says segregation is a-okay. However, it's supposed to have equal facilities, but we all know that is not the case. And that is overturned 6 decades later in Brown v. Board in 1954. So those two closely linked, as it's a Supreme Court ruling overturning a previous Supreme Court ruling on the big topic of civil rights and segregation. Some other ones, First Great Awakening and Enlightenment might be review for a whole bunch of you. This is similar. First Great Awakening being a religious movement and the Enlightenment being a secular movement. One focused on John Locke's ideas, and but they both are occurring at the same time within different groups of people. First Great Awakening, kind of like the Second Great Awakening, big in the backcountry. Enlightenment, bigger with folks who have some wealth and are educated. But they both have a similar effect. So they're both occurring throughout the 1700s. And they both have this similar social and psychological effect of moving colonists away from Great Britain. For the First Great Awakening, it's getting new types of Protestantism and a lot of people leaving the Anglican or British church. And so that kind of, loosens their connections to the British. And then those ideas of the Enlightenment, life, liberty, property, those Locke ideas end up in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Those ideas that you should be able to govern yourself and have representation and everything. So they occur at the same time, albeit with different groups of people, but they both have a somewhat common effect of loosening those bonds to the British. Okay, another one, the Red Scares. First Red Scare and Second Red Scare, both happened after World Wars. And both are focused on the communist threat. And both have a domestic element to it. The first Red Scare with the Palmer raids of arresting suspected anarchists and communists, many of whom are either in unions and or are recent immigrants, sometimes deporting them as well. And then after the Second Red Scare, of course, we have McCarthyism with blacklisting, going after Hollywood and everything first, and other folks and the military. And both of them fueled this era of a huge, deep, concern about communism taking over the United States. So what's a big difference between them? A big difference is the first Red Scare, there is a foreign element to it, and the United States does participate in trying to put down the communist taking power in Russia. However, it's far more so in World War II, post-World War II, where the United States is much more concerned and puts much more resources towards containment of the Soviet Union, which is now a major communist power, and containing communism abroad. So there's much more of a foreign policy element to the Second Red Scare than there is the First Red Scare. Another one that is more of a general connection is Gilded Age Corruption, 1865 to 1900 the Gilded Age. Of course, an era of laissez-faire economics leading to massive economic growth, but also massive problems because the government is not taking care of all the political and business corruption going on. And this leads to the progressive era, those progressive presidents of Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and Woodrow Wilson, breaking up trusts, putting in sometimes siding with workers, governments at local and state levels putting in certain regulations for things like building codes and a variety of different things where the government is becoming more active to try to stamp down that corruption that grew so massively during the Gilded Age. And then the last one I got here, but there are so many other ones, but these are just the top ones that came to my mind. The last one I got here is that comparison between the New Deal and Great Society. New Deal being the 1930s, Great Society being 1960s and onward. Both of them are very similar in that they're progressive liberal reforms. It's being reactive. It's trying to solve the problem of the Great Depression. Whereas during the Great Society, the economy is actually pretty good, and it's being reactive. It's starting programs like Head Start and also other programs like food stamps and housing assistance and things like that, trying to allow for people to have greater opportunity. And also with the Great Society, there is more of a focus on helping minorities as well. So, okay, those are some of the top ones that came to my mind as far as historical connections that show up on multiple choice that also might be great evidence on SAQs and LEQs and DBQs, depending on the topic. Whew. Now, I want to take a drink of water here, and then I'll take some questions. All right, first question. Let's go with Kevin. Are SAQs on period 7 to 9 likely? Yes. So SAQs can be from any of the time periods, periods 1 through 9. There's going to be a total of 4 of them. And I would bet that all 4 are going to be from different eras. Now, the third and the fourth one, you'll have a choice between those. And the first 2 you have to go with. I would bet the first 2 are most likely going to be periods 2 through period 8, but they could have an option on that you have between SAQ 3 and 4. That one might be one of the earliest time period 1 or period 9, but you don't really know. It's kind of a crapshoot. The one thing you will know is that a couple of the SAQs will have stimulus charts or sources from historians or primary sources. And then 1 or 2 of the SAQs will just be straight kind of questions that you got to respond to. Do you have any? Okay, let's go back a little bit to King August. Do you have any SAQ tips? So actually, I did that earlier in the live stream, and it's the ACE formula. I hope you already know the ACE formula. It's a really common one that's taught. I'm sure it's taught in a lot of AP classrooms, and it's a formula that's really great to go with for all your SAQs to try to get a full explanation in of your evidence and everything, and make sure that you do what you need to do to get that point. So I just dropped it in the chat there. And that would be a good one to know and to understand and to have in the back of your mind when you're responding to these SAQs. All right. Fuzzy has, how long should each paragraph of a LEQ or DBQ be? I would say the intro paragraph needs to be long because you should be doing 2 things in your intro paragraph. Technically, you could pick up context anywhere in the essay, but most people go for context and the thesis in the intro paragraph. Check out my example that I went through earlier right here. And do as much as possible to pick up that context points, have some specific details. Start off with the very general. Usually with context, you want to start off with like whatever the era of the prompt is. Start off a little bit before the prompt. Like let's say the prompt is a bit into the 1950s and 60s, wherever the prompt may be. Let's say it's 1945 to 1975, and discuss what is going on in the world, in general the United States, around the topic of the prompt. Don't use documents to try to get the context, though. It's got to be outside info, and it's got to be things that are not a part of your argument, but just gives you a general idea of what's going on. Just like a story, you're setting the scene with context. And in the same paragraph, that intro paragraph should be pretty big. You do a great thesis statement. Don't split the thesis statement separate from the context in the intro. Put them in the same one. So your intro paragraph should be pretty large. Now, when it comes to like how long should like body paragraphs be for LEQs and DBQs, it kind of depends on like how you're structuring it. They could be very large, they could be small. Honestly, with the LEQ, and a lot of you guys are probably going to be hurting on time when you get to the LEQ, you could get literally all the rest of the points of the LEQ with just one body paragraph. You got to have two specific pieces of evidence that you explain and link to your argument and really cover whatever skill they're asking for, comparing and contrasting, causation, whatever it may be. I don't recommend that, especially if you got time. Try to have a more structured essay. But if you're struggling on time with the LEQ, you can literally just have one solid like intro paragraph with context and thesis, and then a large body paragraphs where you just try to fit in that info, pick up as many points as possible. With the DBQ, I tell my students I really like it when they're shooting for the outside evidence point to have its own solid little mini paragraph aside from the documents. Sometimes as an AP reader, one point that is really kind of hard to distinguish is outside evidence. I tell my students as much as possible, and you should always go for the outside evidence point. That point is just sitting there waiting for you to get it. You just need one specific piece of evidence that's not related to any of the documents, and you explain it in further detail and how it relates to your argument. You do that in literally 2 sentences, so a short paragraph. The other paragraphs, it depends. How many documents are you using in the paragraph? I wouldn't really worry about the length. Worry about how well you're using the documents and relating it back to your argument. All right, let's go to Fletcher. When I go for external evidence, can it be a part of HAPP, or does it need to be treated like its own? It cannot be. So Fletcher, outside evidence, external evidence cannot be a part of HAPP. If you're using outside evidence, it cannot be linked to any documents at all. It's got to be its own separate thing. Because if it's linked to a document, with my example earlier when I talked about the Tea Act with the Boston Tea Party. So if you got, let's say, an engraving of the Boston Tea Party, and you bring up the Tea Act, well, and it's right in around you're talking about the Boston Tea Party. Well, that is context for the Boston Tea Party, that Tea Act of 1773. So it's got to be that would be more context than it would be outside evidence. And even though you don't have to, it really helps the AP reader out if you have your outside evidence own little separate mini paragraph. Okay, what should be considered? All right, I kind of covered that one just a second ago, Sylvia, and how much of it is required for the outside evidence. Let's see. Okay, what are the different time periods for the, so Seth has, what are the different time periods for LEQ prompts? The nice thing about LEQ prompts is you actually get 3 of them, and you get to pick just one of those 3. Usually they come from, the first one will most likely be in periods 1 through 3. The second one will most likely be in periods 4 through 6. And the last one will likely be in periods 7 through 9. It could be a part of those periods or a little part, but generally they like to space them out chronologically. And some of the LEQ prompts in years past I've seen have been really easy. Like there was one from a couple of years ago, which was literally just like talking about how slavery and manifest destiny caused the Civil War. It was such a slam dunk. And going to the AP readings before, there's usually one out of the 3 that like 80% of the students chose because it's an easy one like that, and not a whole lot of ones that the other ones chose. So the nice thing with that one is it's usually a variety of time periods, a variety of prompts. And most years, I think there's one prompt that's usually one that is in the wheelhouse for a lot of students to respond to. All right. Okay. So how should you incorporate HAPP into your evidence? So I covered that one a little bit earlier. That one is tough. I want to put that example back in the chat right here. That one's a really hard one to do because like the context, it's one that a lot of students attempt, but they don't always pick it up. And the reason why they don't always pick it up is because they don't link it back to their argument. So let's take a look. I'm going to go into that one that I just put in the chat. Let's take a look at a couple of the examples I got in there. So if I go down to purpose, which is are the 4 HIP or HAPP. The two that I like the most are historical context, situation, and purpose, because I think those are the two that flow the best into an essay and also to relate it back to your argument. So with purpose, if you look at my example here, let's say we have some example of an anti-immigrant political cartoon. You should have seen some, throughout your time in AP US history so far. Some cartoon that's anti-Irish, anti-Chinese, 1880s, 1850s or 40s before. And so, you might say something along these lines. As a political cartoon, it had the purpose of stoking Americans' fear, who in turn demanded the government reduce or shut off immigration. This proves xenophobia. This proves the xenophobia many Americans had at the time. So notice how you're talking about the purpose, stoking Americans' fear, and then you're relating that back to xenophobia. And let's say that the prompt is something about anti-immigrant attitudes. All right. So you're linking that back to the prompt there. And a great whether you're trying to pick up HIP or you're just using a document, a great phrase to say is either "this proves" or "this shows," because then you're linking it back. You're linking it back in your mind, in your writing, and to the person who's reading your writing, that you're linking that document, the HIP, or however you're using the document as evidence, you're linking that back to your argument. So use that phrase, "this shows," "this proves." There might be a few other phrases that are good as well to link it back to your argument. I have some other examples on there as well. Okay, let's go to Grace. Are there ever going to be very broad topics, like just about women in general or slavery or African-American rights? Okay, so this one, let me talk about one DBQ. This one is not a public DBQ, but I'll bring it up in general terms here. So there's a DBQ a couple of years ago that covered one topic over a 100-year period. It was a topic of slavery. And that's pretty rare. I don't usually see that long of a time period. And actually, the DBQs from all the ones that were administered that year, I thought that was actually the hardest because of the long time frame of it. Most DBQs are going to fit more into a 30 to 60 year time frame. 100 was very rare, and I think that's the only time I've actually seen a 100-year time period DBQ. So most of the time, it's going to be much more confined to somewhere around 3 to 6 decades. Let's go to. Will the MCQ answer be stapled to the back of the test? I'm not sure, but one thing I will say about the multiple choice, generally they go in chronological order. From the exams I've seen recently, there was a time when they kind of bounced around a bit more between time periods, and they still sometimes bounce a little bit around, but you're probably going to see your multiple choice go mostly in chronological order throughout there. So you might, especially if you're stronger in one time period, like let's say there's one time period you're really weak on, you might strategize a little bit with trying to save time. Let's say it's period 4. That tends to be a time period a lot of kids struggle with. You get some multiple choice from period 4. And you might want to save those, come back to them later or something like that. Never leave an answer, one of those blank though. Always give it a shot. You don't get penalized for getting them wrong. We only count up points on the test. So always go back to it. But you might come back, you might have some from a time period you're not too confident on. And let's say you end up with a bunch of time at the end of it because you worked through the rest of the questions already. And you got a question set from period 4 you're not, too sure about, or whatever time period 2, whatever. Go back to spend some more time on it. Carefully read through the source and everything. Some of the sources on the multiple choice you'll recognize, or you should recognize. Sometimes they're really common ones, like Common Sense from Thomas Paine. Other times there's sources that are historians or graphs or primary sources that you don't have any background knowledge at all. So you really got to rely upon that era that it's from, looking at that date when you first get that, multiple choice set. And, what's the date? What's going on in that time period? What do you know about it? So you're always kind of adjusting your mind as you're going through that multiple choice exam, because you're always kind of moving through time and thinking about what is going on, at that era. Will you get prompts on a very specific person and what they did for the DBQ and LEQ? No, you'll never get a prompt on like a specific person. It'll always be, the prompts are based upon the course exam description, the course and exam description guide of the College Board, which is this massive guide, and it's basically telling us what we need to teach about. And most of the things in there are very kind of like general themes, key ideas that we got to get across. And so that's where they get a lot of the DBQ and LEQ prompts from. So you're never going to have like John Adams, hero or villain. You're never going to have something like that. It's going to be more broad themes and concepts and everything. Women's rights movement from 1890 to 1920. How big of an impact did it have? How big of an impact did the settlement of the West, from 1840 to 1900 have on the American economy? It's going to be much more bigger, broader themes and topics than ever an individual person or even a singular, once in a while, a major event, like possibly like something like the Great Depression, but more likely a big, broad theme over 4 to 6 decades. All right. Can the thesis and the DBQ LEQ be placed anywhere in the essay? No, it cannot, but it can be placed in 2 places. As an AP reader, you're trained to look in the intro. So the intro should probably have both context and thesis. And generally the thesis comes after the context. And it could also be in the conclusion as well. This is why if you have the time, well, there's not necessarily on either rubric, the LEQ or the DBQ, a point for the conclusion. If you have the time, write a conclusion where you go back over your argument. There has been a lot of essays that I've read at the AP reading where the person gets the thesis point for the conclusion because they were more specific with their argument. And in the intro, they were too vague with their thesis. But then they wrote a conclusion and they're more specific with it. And that saved them like the point. A point that you really need to pick up on both the LEQ and the DBQ is that thesis point. So again, if you got the time, do a conclusion, go back over your argument and be more specific about what you discussed in your body paragraphs. All right. The thesis, I don't see too many other. Okay. Does Rocky beating Drago work as extra evidence? The topic has to be the downfall of the Soviet Union, so although I wouldn't plan on getting, although if it was me at the AP reading and some student made a great argument about, Rocky beating Drago and then leading to the downfall of the Soviet Union, I would probably just secretly still take it, but I wouldn't bet on it though. What are some strategies to use if you only have a vague understanding for the topic of the DBQ and LEQ? So if you only have a vague understanding, try to pick up the easiest point. Let's talk about the DBQ. At minimum, the DBQ, even if you have a vague understanding, you can still get 2 out of those 7 points. As I mentioned earlier in the stream, on average, it's usually only somewhere around like 2.7 out of 7. I've never seen it over 3 as an average on a DBQ out of 7. So the bar is pretty low. So the 2 points you got to be able to pick up, even if you get the DBQ and you're like, I don't know anything about this topic. There are 2 points you can always pick up: the thesis and using at least 3 documents, discussing at least 3. You don't even need to link those documents back to your argument. You just got to discuss them. Don't quote the documents. Use their main ideas, but just take the 3 easiest ones and discuss them. So for the thesis, though, you got to have, you read through the prompt, make some sort of argument. One trick to do, especially if you're you don't understand the topic of the DBQ, is to look through the documents in your own words. Take the main idea of some of the easiest documents in there out of the 7. Take the 3 or 4 easiest documents out of the 7. Take the main idea and use those as your main points for the thesis. And then discuss those documents in your body paragraphs. You're going to be guaranteed at least 2 of those points. So if all of a sudden you get a DBQ and you're like, oh my God, I don't know this topic, a fail safe to get 2 of those points is to do that. main idea of 3 of those documents in your own words, make those a part of your thesis, and then discuss them in your body. Not my okay, but actually a username okay. What is an example of outside information for a Gilded Age prompt? So like I would need the actual DBQ and like what the documents are. In general, I'll say your outside information cannot be related to any of the documents. But let's say, let me make one off the top of my head. Let's say you have something about the Gilded Age, about how industrialization leads to many social and economic problems or whatever. And in there, you have nothing about, for some reason, there's nothing about political machines. There's not a single document about the corruption of political machines in cities. And so you know in your own background knowledge that you know about New York City and Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed and how they controlled politics in New York City. And there's not a single document about it. So you bring that up. You have its own little separate mini paragraph. You bring that up. You say, you discuss about like, and the problem of political corruption even extended to cities, as we see in New York with the Tammany Hall political machine controlling politics of the city and funneling taxpayer money, into the corrupt politicians' back pockets. There you go. Is a rebuttal needed in LEQ and DBQ? Nope. You can do a rebuttal, especially if you got time to possibly try to pick up the complexity point. I wouldn't worry about the complexity point of the DBQ though. So few get it. I'm talking like less than 2%. I think sometimes even less than 1% of DBQs actually get the complexity point. But let's say you happen to have a whole bunch of extra time, give it a go. And one way to possibly do that is to bring up a counterpoint. It would fall under the like qualifying or modifying your argument sub kind of point of the complexity point. But for a lot of students, that complexity point, I'll just say it, it's out of reach, and it's something that's extremely difficult to pick up. And almost, I would say for most students, not even worth worrying about. Okay, this is gonna be the last one I'm gonna take here. Then I'm gonna go to bed pretty soon here. So, does context of a document count as outside info? This is a common misconception that you can double dip on points. So it does not count as outside info. At the AP reading, we can only count outside info. If it's related to a document, we can only count it for a HIP, a possible HIP point. If it's not related to a document, then it's outside evidence. They can never go together. It's called double dipping, and it can never go together. So that's something that's stressed at the AP reading, and something that cannot happen. That's why I always say, like, put your outside evidence in its own little separate mini paragraph somewhere as an easy way to separate it from your discussion of the documents. Okay, so I'm going to call her for tonight. And hopefully I was able to give you guys some good resources, and good luck on your exam. Try not to stress out too much. Go into it with some confidence. That's sometimes the best thing that people can do to have success on it as well. All right. Have a good night.